General Nicholas Harrison's bloodshot eyes flickered open in the dim, sterile room. The air hummed with the soft whir of alien machinery, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural glow. The pain in his limbs was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the ceaseless agony that had been gnawing at him for days. His body, bruised and battered, was chained to a metal chair, hands bound tight to the armrests. His head hung low, as though surrendering to the darkness, but his mind was sharp, alert, calculating. He'd been tortured for what felt like an eternity. The Zenthrix aliens relentless in their attempts to break him. They thought they could extract humanity's deepest secrets by forcing him to yield. What they didn't realize was that he wasn't just a human general. He was far more dangerous than they could possibly understand. He was a vampire, cursed with immortality, hardened by centuries of battle, and bound by the honor of his cause. The Zenthrix were fools if they believed they could break him. The aliens' leader, Commander of Cthar, stood before him, towering an alien with its elongated limbs and spindly, almost insect-like features. The glowing red eyes gleamed as he studied his prisoner with a smug satisfaction. His voice, a guttural rasp, echoed in the cold room. "You will tell us everything, General Harrison. You cannot hide the truth from us any longer. Your people's secrets will be ours." Nick lifted his head slowly, his gaze steady and unyielding. He'd never been one for giving in. In all his years of military service on Earth and beyond, he'd faced every kind of foe, most of them more dangerous than anything the Zenthrix could throw at him. Torture? That was for the weak. The Zenthrix weren't even close to knowing what real pain was. He smirked inwardly. Even though his mouth was dry, his body screaming for release. Cthar moved closer, and the sound of his voice became sharper. "You think yourself strong, don't you? Your people are nothing. When we are finished, humanity will be wiped from the galaxy." Nick clenched his fists, the chains rattling slightly, but they did not give. He knew better than to let the aliens see any signs of weakness, no matter how much his body ached. He could endure it. He had endured far worse. He'd learned to survive centuries of torment, and this was no different. "Your people will be wiped from the galaxy long before we are," he muttered through gritted teeth, his voice rough but defiant. He didn't flinch, not even as Cthar raised his hand. A strange, pulsating energy crackled in the air as a device was activated, and a sharp, piercing pain shot through Nick's skull. The alien technology was designed to probe his mind, to unravel his thoughts, to make him relive every moment of human suffering. Nick gritted his teeth, his eyes clenching shut. He'd been through worse. 1,000 years of war, 2,000. He could hear the screams of his comrades as though they were still fresh. But he refused to let them control him now. The pain was nothing. The images flashing in his mind were familiar, distant memories. The loss of his family, the blood-stained battles, the centuries of isolation. But none of it would break him. He'd trained himself for this. He had learned to endure. And they didn't know what he really was. Cthar's voice broke through his mental haze, the alien's tone growing impatient. "Why resist? We have all the time in the galaxy. You will submit. You will break." Nick's lip twitched at the word. The alien was wrong. He would not break. There was power in his blood. Power far beyond anything these fools could comprehend. His muscles tensed, his teeth clenching as his mind began to clear. The Zenthrix were using their technology to invade his mind, to explore his memories. But they didn't realize that there were places they could never reach. Places even Nick himself couldn't fully control. He could feel it now, buried deep within him. The hunger, the power, pushing against the chains that bound him. His body ached as the vampire within him stirred, craving release. He could heal faster than any human, recover from wounds that would kill others. But the real power, the strength, lay in his blood, the strength that had allowed him to survive the impossible. Cthar leaned closer, peering into Nick's eyes with his glowing red pupils, thinking he had won. The alien's confidence made Nick want to laugh. It was almost laughable how little they understood. The torture, The pain, all of it, it wasn't enough. Not for Nick. Not for a vampire. Just as Thar raised his hand to strike again, something changed. The air shifted, thickened, as if the room itself had sensed a shift in Nick's aura. His eyes, once dull with exhaustion, flared bright red. The chains that had held him began to strain, twisting and warping, metal groaning, as if it could sense the power awakening within him. The Zenthrix commander stepped back, alarm flashing across his alien face. "What is this?" Thar demanded, his voice cracking. "You're just a human." Nick's smile grew cold. His fangs, long and sharp, slid into place, gleaming in the dim light. The power was surging within him now, flooding his veins, awakening the ancient hunger he'd fought to suppress. But now, the time had come. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a human. He was something far older, far deadlier. He tested his strength. The chain snapped under the force of his movement, as though they were nothing but paper. The Zenthrix in the room, 2 soldiers standing guard, stiffened in shock. They were too slow to react as Nick surged forward, his movements a blur of speed and power. With a snarl, Nick reached out, grabbing one of the guards by the throat and lifting him off the ground, squeezing until the alien's eyes bulged. The soldier struggled, but it was useless. Nick's strength was too much for them to handle. He tossed the creature aside like a rag doll, sending it crashing into the far wall. Thar's expression morphed into one of disbelief. "What are you?" Nick didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his senses heightened. The alien scent was all around him, sweat, fear, and metallic coldness. The commander reached for a weapon, but it was too late. With a speed that even the Zenthrix couldn't follow, Nick was upon him, lifting the alien off the ground with one hand, his red eyes burning with fury. "You thought you could break me," Nick growled, his voice low and dangerous. "But you have no idea what you're dealing with." Thar struggled, but Nick's grip tightened, and the alien's throat was crushed with a sickening crunch. His body went limp, and Nick tossed the lifeless form aside. For a moment, there was silence. The only sound was the hum of the alien technology, still pulsing in the background. Nick stood in the center of the room, panting lightly, his body healing rapidly from the strain. His fangs retracted, but the hunger was still there, lurking beneath the surface. The Zenthrix had underestimated him. They had no idea what he really was. Nick stepped out into the hallway, his mind still racing from the chaos of his escape. The alien fortress was a maze of steel and cold, its vast corridors illuminated by the faint glow of alien technology. He could feel the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, his senses heightened beyond their normal limits. The Zenthrix were powerful, no question, but he had just shown them a glimpse of what they were up against. They had no idea what they were dealing with, but the mission wasn't over. Far from it. His breath slowed as he cleared his thoughts, focusing on the task at hand. He wasn't here just to escape. He was here to cripple the Zenthrix invasion and give humanity a fighting chance. They thought they could break him, but in the process, they had unleashed something far worse, a war-hardened vampire with a vendetta. And that, he knew, was the Zenthrix's greatest mistake. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hall, sharp and quick. Nick pressed himself against the wall, his instincts taking over. His senses picked up on the 2 Zenthrix soldiers approaching. Their voices were clipped alien, and their presence a stark reminder that his escape wasn't going unnoticed. "Did you hear what happened to Commander Thar?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice a low growl. "Yeah, the human didn't break. He changed." The second soldier's voice held a hint of fear. "Thar is dead. That thing killed him. What kind of human does that?" Nick's lips curled into a grin as he prepared himself. These 2 wouldn't be any different than the others. Their arrogance had clouded their judgment, thinking that a few chains and probes could bring him to heel. They were about to learn that their kind wasn't prepared for a creature like him. The first soldier rounded the corner, and Nick struck like a shadow. His speed was blinding. faster than any human could comprehend. He grabbed the soldier by the neck, his grip like iron, lifting him off the ground. The soldier gurgled in panic, but Nick didn't waste time with words. With a swift motion, he twisted the creature's neck, snapping it with an almost casual flick. The second soldier stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide in shock, but Nick was already on him. He moved with the precision of a predator, slamming the soldier into the wall and pinning him there. The alien's attempts to struggle were futile. Nick's strength was far too much for him to handle. The vampire's fangs gleamed as he leaned in, a silent promise of death in his eyes. "You Zenthrix are weak," Nick growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know how to fight. Not like us. Not like me." With a quick motion, he drained the soldier of life, leaving nothing but a crumpled body in his wake. He let the corpse fall to the ground with a soft thud, his mind focused. He couldn't afford to waste time. The Zenthrix would be onto him soon, and he still had a long way to go. The air felt thick with tension as Nick moved further into the fortress. His mind raced, planning his next move. The ship, that was where the heart of the invasion was. It was what he needed to destroy, and he knew exactly how to do it. The Zenthrix had built their stronghold on their own arrogance, believing themselves to be the apex predators. But they were wrong. Humanity had always found a way to survive. And Nick, with his centuries of experience and his unyielding will, was going to make sure the Zenthrix understood exactly why. As he continued through the cold, metallic halls, a sense of foreboding began to settle in his gut. He had to keep moving. His plan had always been one of precision, stealth, and overwhelming force when necessary. The Zenthrix had learned the first part of that lesson. Now, they'd learn the second. Suddenly, his communicator buzzed. The voice that crackled through was one Nick knew well. Captain James Jace Carter, his second-in-command back on Earth. "General, you've been gone too long." Jace's voice was filled with concern, but also a hint of sarcasm, as usual. "We're getting word that the Zenthrix are preparing for a full assault. If you're still in one piece, we could use you back at the command center." Nick's lips twitched, an ironic smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. Back at the command center. That's where he should be, but right now, his focus was here on the Zenthrix stronghold, where he could do the most damage. He had to hit them hard before they could launch the full-scale invasion. If he didn't, humanity would be doomed. "Hang tight, Jace." "I'm not done here," Nick replied, his voice low and steady. "I'll be in touch. Just make sure the rest of the team is ready for what's coming." "Roger that. We've got your six, sir." Nick ended the transmission and slipped the communicator back into his pocket. He knew Jace had his back, knew the rest of the team would be ready for whatever came next. But for now, it was just him and the Zenthrix, and he wasn't about to let them win. The fortress seemed endless, a sprawling structure of metal and strange energy fields that hummed with the power of alien technology. Nick knew it wouldn't be long before the Zenthrix realized their mistake and began hunting him down. They'd be more cautious now, more deliberate. But that was fine. He was ready. He stopped at a large door, its surface covered in alien symbols. The markings were unfamiliar, but Nick wasn't about to let that slow him down. He had faced far worse in his lifetime. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled a small device from his belt, a key that could bypass most alien security systems. It slid into place with a satisfying click, and the door swung open. Inside, the hum of the ship was deafening. The room was filled with alien machinery, large screens flashing with incomprehensible data. But Nick's eyes were locked on one thing: the Central Command Console, the heart of the Zenthrix invasion force. If he could destroy it, he could cripple the entire operation. And maybe, just maybe, the Zenthrix would learn a lesson they would never forget. As he moved toward the console, something in the air shifted. A sound, footsteps too many to count, echoed down the hall. Nick's senses flared, alert for danger. He wasn't alone anymore. A voice echoed through the room, low and commanding. "You think you can stop the Zenthrix? Nick's lips curled into a smirk. It's showtime. Nick stood alone in the dimly lit command room, the distant hum of the Zenthrix fortress echoing like the steady beat of a war drum. He could feel the eyes of the approaching Zenthrix soldiers upon him, their presence unmistakable as their footfalls grew louder, closer. But he was calm, even as the weight of the moment pressed on him. This was what he had prepared for, what he had become over centuries of survival, and what the Zenthrix could never truly understand. Human resilience, sharpened by the bite of something much older and far more dangerous. He turned toward the central console, his mind calculating, racing ahead of the inevitable conflict about to unfold. The alien machinery whirred, its green-tinted screens casting an eerie glow over his face. It wasn't just the heart of the fortress. It was the heart of the Zenthrix's entire invasion plan. Destroying it meant crippling their war effort, and in Nick's mind, a win for humanity. A victory they could not afford to miss. A deep voice broke through his thoughts, vibrating the very air around him. "You're a fool, human," the Zenthrix leader sneered, stepping into view. His skin was as black as the void between the stars, his form tall and imposing, its multiple arms ending in sharp claws. "You cannot stop the inevitable. We've waited for centuries to conquer this world. Your resistance will break. You will break." Nick's eyes narrowed. He recognized the Zenthrix, Admiral Zorkel, the commander who had orchestrated much of the invasion. The thought of him cowering behind the safety of a starship fleet was almost laughable, now that Nick had him within reach. The alien had been a pawn in a much larger game, and now that game was coming to an end. "I don't think you're getting the message, Zorkel," Nick replied, his voice colder than the vacuum of space itself. "You've underestimated us." "You've underestimated me," Zorkel hissed, his eyes narrowing as his claws flexed in fury. "Underestimate you? You're just a man, no different than the others we've crushed. We'll break you like we broke your people." Nick's lips curled into a grin, his fangs gleaming in the soft light. The truth was, they had no idea what he had become. His transformation had been slow, gradual, a survival instinct perfected over lifetimes of battle. The Zenthrix had seen humans as mere prey. But Nick wasn't merely a man anymore. He was something more. Before Zorkel could react, Nick moved, his body a blur of motion. His claws tore into the console, a sickening screech filling the room as sparks flew. The alien machinery groaned in protest, but Nick's strength was too much for it. The console shattered in an explosion of sparks and smoke, sending a shockwave through the room. The remaining Zenthrix soldiers charged forward, their weapons raised. But Nick was already on them. His movements were fluid, calculated. He dodged the first soldier's energy blast with ease, moving in a blur to close the distance between them. He grabbed the soldier by the throat and slammed him against the wall. The Zenthrix's body went limp, its weapon falling to the floor with a soft clatter. Another soldier lunged, but Nick was quicker. He twisted the alien's arm, disarming him before driving a blade of his own into the creature's chest. It crumpled lifeless before it even hit the ground. Zorkel watched in growing disbelief as the soldiers fell one by one, their bodies discarded like broken toys. The alien leader had thought he had power. He had thought that humanity was weak, that they could be crushed under the boot of the Zenthrix. But now, with every alien that fell, Zorkel's conviction wavered. Nick was no ordinary human, no mere soldier. Nick's fangs gleamed as he turned toward the Zenthrix leader, a predatory smile on his face. "You were saying?" Zorkel's eyes flashed with rage, but he knew he was losing control. He had no more soldiers to fight with, no backup from his fleet. This was it. The human had come for him, and Nick wasn't the kind of man who left loose ends. The alien commander clenched his fists, his many arms twitching in frustration. "You think you've won, human? Even now, the invasion is in motion. You can't stop it." Nick's smile didn't falter. "That's where you're wrong." He reached out and ripped another piece of machinery from the wall, tossing it aside with contempt. With one swift movement, He brought down a blade, slicing through the remaining power conduits and shutting down the fortress's energy systems. The room plunged into darkness, and the soft whirring of the alien machinery fell silent. Zorkel stumbled back, his claws raised, sensing the sudden change in the air. "What have you done?" Nick advanced slowly, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I've done what you couldn't even comprehend. I've stopped you. The moment you tried to break me, you signed your own death warrant. You thought your technology and your strength made you untouchable. You never once considered what a man is capable of when pushed to the edge." The alien commander snarled, charging at Nick with all the ferocity of a wounded animal. But Nick was faster, too fast. With a single motion, he sidestepped and swept Zorkel's legs out from under him. The alien hit the ground with a sickening thud, but before he could recover, Nick was on him. "This is how it ends for you," Nick whispered. "Not with some glorious battle, but with the crushing realization that you were just another predator. And now, the hunter has become the hunted." Zorkel attempted to claw at Nick, but his arms were too slow, his strength waning. Nick's fangs found their mark, tearing into the alien's throat with lethal precision. Zorkel's struggle grew weaker, his life draining away into Nick's embrace. The Zenthrix leader's eyes widened, his last words a garbled mix of shock and disbelief. With a final, swift motion, Nick tore the commander's head from his body, the act as effortless as swatting a fly. The room fell silent once more, the tension that had built up over the past hours finally dissipating. Nick stood over the fallen alien, his chest heaving with exertion. He had won, but it wasn't the end. There was still more to do, more to destroy. The Zenthrix were still out there waiting, but now they knew what humanity could do. Now they knew that they weren't facing an army of weaklings. They were facing something far more dangerous. As Nick turned to leave the shattered command room, a smirk tugged at his lips. There was more work to be done, but for now, the Zenthrix had learned an important lesson. Never underestimate the strength of a human, and never, ever think you can control a vampire. Nick stood on the bridge of the human resistance flagship, overlooking the dark expanse of space. The faint, flickering lights of distant stars barely illuminated the looming Zenthrix armada that hung before him. His fingers traced the cool surface of the command console, his mind lost in thought. His victory over Zorkel had been swift, but the war was far from over. The Zenthrix still controlled vast stretches of territory, and humanity's survival depended on every move they made from here on out. Yet, even with his fangs still gleaming from the fight, there was something unsettling in the pit of his stomach. The battle had been won, but something told him the Zenthrix weren't done. There was always another enemy, another battle on the horizon. They wouldn't stop until they had humanity under their thumb. Admiral Mercer, came a familiar voice, dragging him from his reverie. Gregor Thorne, his right-hand man, stepped onto the bridge. He was as sharp as they came, tactical genius, master marksman and Nick's most trusted ally. He stood at attention, his eyes scanning the vastness of space, calculating. "What's the word, Gregor?" Nick asked, his voice gruff, yet calm. It had been a long road to this point, but the calm after a storm always felt like the moment before the next strike. "We've located their flagship," Gregor replied, eyes narrowing. "It's heavily fortified, but I think we can take it down if we play it right. The Zenthrix think they're safe, but they've made a mistake in underestimating us again." Nick's gaze hardened. Underestimating us is something they'll come to regret over and over. Let's finish this. But even as he spoke, Nick felt that gnawing feeling return. Something about this victory felt too easy. The Zenthrix hadn't expected a human to stand against them, especially not one like Nick, a creature born of both man and vampire. But Nick knew better than anyone that easy victories often came with consequences. The Zenthrix were cunning. They had learned to adapt quickly, and he wouldn't be caught off guard again. "We need to move fast," Gregor continued, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "Their fleet is regrouping, and if we don't strike now, they'll have time to reinforce." Once we take down their flagship, the rest will follow. Nick nodded, his decision made in an instant. Prepare the fleet. We strike in 1 hour. The crew bustled around them, activating the necessary commands, prepping the ships for battle. Nick watched them work, his heart swelling with pride. These were humans, flawed, imperfect, but capable of feats no alien invader could understand. They fought for something that was theirs. They fought for Earth. An hour later, the flagship of the human fleet emerged from the shadows of a nearby moon. The Zenthrix armada had finally noticed, but it was too late. Nick's fleet moved with military precision, their ships positioning themselves in a pattern that would break the Zenthrix defenses wide open. The first volley of missiles shot across the vacuum of space, their target, the Zenthrix flagship. The explosion was catastrophic. It lit up the sky like a burst of fire, a testament to human ingenuity. But Nick's eyes weren't on the fireworks. He was scanning, searching for the next move. The Zenthrix would retaliate in force. He knew that much. They were a proud race, and this loss would only drive them to be more vicious. Get the boarding teams ready, Nick ordered. We're going in. Time to finish what we started. He turned, his coat billowing behind him as he strode toward the docking bay, the sound of heavy boots echoing in the corridors. His thoughts were clear, sharp, focused. The Zenthrix had made one fatal mistake by thinking the war was over. Humanity was far from defeated. And now, it was time for Nick to make sure they paid for their arrogance. As he boarded the assault shuttle with Gregor and a team of soldiers, the small craft was already humming with power, ready for the jump to the Zenthrix flagship. The familiar weight of his weapon in his hand gave Nick a sense of calm. He was ready. The shuttle lurched forward, accelerating through space with terrifying speed. The flagship was enormous, its dark, jagged shape a testament to Zenthrix design, blunt, brutal, and imposing. But there was something about it that felt hollow. It was a thing of strength, but strength without heart, without the tenacity that humanity held. When they arrived at the flagship's docking bay, they were met with the usual chaos. Zenthrix soldiers, their sleek black armor shimmering in the low light, charged toward them, weapons raised. Nick's mind went to autopilot, his body moving faster than his thoughts. He dispatched the first alien with ease, tearing through its defense like paper, his strength amplified by centuries of experience. A few more followed, their bodies falling lifeless to the ground before Nick moved on. He and Gregor cut a path through the halls of the flagship, their teamwork flawless. Each of Nick's movements was swift and brutal, his fangs and claws leaving a trail of destruction. The Zenthrix soldiers that faced him quickly learned that no amount of strength could overcome the precision and hunger of a vampire driven by the need to protect what was his. As they reached the command center, Nick's senses flared. The Zenthrix were waiting, a final line of defense, more soldiers, more traps, and an endless supply of reinforcements. But Nick wasn't worried. He had anticipated this. He could already feel the battle drawing to a close, the final stages approaching. The doors to the command center slid open with a hiss, revealing a grand chamber filled with alien technology and flickering screens. At the far end of the room stood the Zenthrix commander, another one of their generals, more dangerous than Zorkel, his armor black as midnight, eyes glowing with malice. "You," the general sneered, his voice deep and venomous. "You will die just like the others, human. The Zenthrix will not be stopped by the likes of you." Nick's eyes glowed red, his fangs a sharp contrast against the darkness of the room. "I think you're the one who's mistaken. This is where your war ends." He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. Every breath he took in the tense silence felt like it could be his last, or the last of the Zenthrix, if he had his way. The final battle loomed before them, an inevitable clash between the unstoppable force of human determination and the unyielding strength of an alien empire that had underestimated them every step of the way. The Zenthrix would learn, one way or another, that they had made a mistake by attacking Earth. Nick's hand tightened around his weapon, and as he advanced, the weight of the war seemed to grow heavier. But it was nothing he couldn't carry. He had been carrying it for centuries, And now, with one final fight ahead, he would ensure the Zenthrix learned the price of underestimating humanity. The end was near, and it was Nick who would deliver it.